Okay, just as a reminder, we do still have the first chapter contest that will be due on November 30th and the Cozy Christmas Mystery Contest that will be due on December 21st. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to email me or leave a comment on this video. As far as today's lesson, we have retelling stories. So this includes fairy tales, but this also includes anything in the public domain, because there is a surprising amount in the public domain that has yet to be retold. Or if it has been retold, it's been retold in such a similar format that it's not necessarily a retelling, it's more of just a reiterating, almost. Kind of like Disney's Cinderella and the original Cinderella, they basically just took out all the creepy bits. It was basically the exact same story, but they took out all the creepy bits. Now, the reason why that works is because it's one of the first retellings, not the first, but one of the first retellings of Cinderella. So having a lot of similarities was perfectly fine. However, we're going to talk later about how this can actually be somewhat detrimental for you. But first, we're going to talk about the public domain. So, retelling stories is all fine and good. Fantastic. I would highly encourage it. Please do. There are so many stories that are like, hey, this was good. But then you retell it from the villain's point of view. Epic. Retell it as a sci-fi. Epic. Gets even cooler when you re-add in some razzle-dazzle of uniqueness. But first, make sure it is in the public domain. Because you do not want to finish a story and then have to pay someone to publish your story because of the fact that you have to pay royalties. That's going to be a pain in the butt. Especially if you want to go independent. You cannot go independent publishing-wise and have something that isn't in the public domain. You want to go traditional. So if you want to go independently publish, or even if you want to traditionally publish easier, the best thing to do is find something that's in the public domain. Now, most of the time you can easily Google, is fill in the blank title in the public domain, and it will say yes or no. However, there are a few that are caveats. For example, there was a retelling done of The Great Gatsby, and that was done technically a year before it was in the public domain. So as a result of that fact, they waited to publish it until it was in the public domain. The publisher was wise and said, hey, I love the story, think this is great, let's wait a year so that way we don't have to pay anyone. Because it was literally 1 year from being in the public domain. And sometimes that's all it takes, is just 1 more year. It is a certain amount of time before it moves into the public domain. And even then, with it moving into the public domain, keep in mind that there are certain things, like I said, that you will and won't want to do with regards to that. So, with the public domain, generally, I cannot remember the exact number, but let's put it this way. If Great Gatsby is just barely becoming in the public domain as of a couple years ago, it's a long time. That is a really old book. So, with the public domain, you also want to make sure that even if it is in the public domain, you do your research on what is the original one. Because sometimes it's been in the public domain so long that there are several retellings by this point, and there's like so many that you're going, okay, who wrote it originally? And that's the best thing you can do in this case, is Google who wrote the original. Alright. That will be important more later. Alright. Now, as I mentioned before, it's important that you put your own spin on it. If you are the first person retelling this story, then it's okay to stick a little bit closer to the original. The reason why is because of the fact that people haven't seen a lot of retellings, so even just a slight spin makes it interesting. However, the more you can spin it to make it your own, the more interest you're going to have, irregardless of whether you're the first person to retell this story or not. That being said, when I say spin, I mean all sorts of things. I mean change the genre, change the narrative, change the moral of the story, change the point of view. Examples of this: change the genre. Shades of Milk and Honey by Mary Robinette Kowal is a great example of changing the genre. She retells Pride and Prejudice, but with magic. Fantasy, very nice. Then you also have another classic one, Cinder by Marissa Meyer. This is Cinderella, but science fiction. And so as a result, that alone changes it enough that it makes the story unique and interesting and new. Changing the narrative. Instead of telling it from Cinderella's point of view, tell it from the stepsister's point of view. Tell it from the stepmother's point of view. Tell it from the prince's point of view. This narrative change can sometimes be all you need to make it super interesting and unique. However, I would still say try to your best to make it the way you think the story should be, instead of just going exactly verbatim what the original story said. That is going to make it slightly more boring for your reader. If they're just like, oh, this is the part where Cinderella shows up, they're bored. However, if you're like, and Cinderella busts through a wall to save the prince, that's more interesting. So even if all you're changing is the narrative, make sure that you still put your own twist on it. Make your characters your own. If you want to change the moral of the story, if it's some sort of like Aesop's fable type thing, how are you changing the moral? Why are you changing the moral? How does changing the moral affect how the story is told? And the last one is having a change in the point of view. Now, this is different from change in narrative, because narrative means that you're telling it from a different point of view, but you are also narrating it from that point of view. However, changing in point of view can simply be Cinderella's the bad guy in this one. So not necessarily point of view, but how you see the world has changed. That point of view of the story has changed. I think a great one, I don't remember the author for this one, unfortunately, but it's something like Tales from a Not-So-Fairy Godmother, something like that. And basically it's contemporary fantasy, where the fairy godmother basically shows up and tries to help the stepsister, because the stepsister's like, okay, I'm upset. Cinderella's the worst. She stole my boyfriend. Like, this is unacceptable. He cheated on me with Cinderella, and yet he gets the happily ever after with her. That's not fair. And so she wishes to the fairy godmother all these different things. And the fairy godmother, in a very genie-like manner, twists her wishes. It's very interesting. It was a very compelling read. Anyway, with that being said, sometimes that point of view change or that narrative change or change in moral or genre can really help bring the story to light and make it pop more. All right. Next thing. We don't want it to be an exact replica. If you're basically trying to rewrite the story exactly as it was, but in your own words, kind of like, you know, how your teacher says, write the definition for physics, but in your own words, that isn't going to go so great for fiction. The reason why is because of the fact that most of the time, the people who originally wrote it have a high bar for how they wrote it. For example, some of the stuff that's coming into the public domain, Dracula, Sherlock Holmes, Pride and Prejudice, those are all things that people love. If you are trying to retell it exactly the exact same, perfect replica, but in your own words, people are automatically going to find it less cool because of the fact that, I'm sorry, but you're not Jane Austen. You're you. So tell it originally and uniquely yours and make it cooler because it's yours. Don't try to be Jane Austen. Don't try to be Arthur Conan Doyle. Like, you don't need to be those people. You're going to seem less cool if you try to mimic a famous person than if you just say, this is my story now, and we're going to twist it my way. Because your own unique story is what's beautiful about the story. If you just try to do the exact same thing as someone else, then you're forever going to be compared to that other person, even if you're a fantastic writer. I bet you if J.K. Rowling and Jane Austen got into a writing battle writing the exact same story, there would be half the people who would be on Jane Austen's side and half the people who would be on J.K. Rowling's side. Because they're just so different. You cannot possibly, it's like comparing apples and oranges. And so it'd be the same thing with you. You might ultimately be the most gorgeous, crisp, lovely apple, but because you're not an orange, people are upset now. So make sure it is not a replica. Make sure you have your own spin and twist on it. Because without it, ultimately, you're going to suffer and struggle because they're going to be comparing you to something that you are not. You are unique and amazing as a writer by yourself. You don't need their help to become famous and amazing. You can do this, and you got this. So don't rely on solely their story by itself. All right. Next thing is key elements. So, if you are retelling a fairy tale, but also if you are retelling a story, make sure that you keep the key elements of the story. So, for example, with Cinderella, she still meets the prince. She still goes to the ball. She still runs out of the ball at midnight and loses her shoe. Those are all key elements of the story. She still has stepsisters. She still has a stepmom. Her stepmom and one of the stepsisters is super mean to her. With Cinder, it has all those key elements of the classic Cinderella story, but it does them in a uniquely science fiction way. But if she had just said, it's Cinderella, and then had none of those key elements, she didn't go to a ball, she didn't have stepsisters, she didn't have a stepmom, her life was totally awesome, she didn't lose a shoe on the way out of the ball, all those things were missing, it wouldn't be a Cinderella retelling. So it's important to remember to have those key elements of whatever story you are trying to retell. All right. Now we're going to talk about short stories. So, fairy tales work great to do a retelling short story version. The reason why is because they were originally short stories. Making them into novels is easy because all you have to do is elongate the short story. However, I would never ever recommend making a novel into a short story. If you try to turn Dracula into 3 pages, it's going to be awful. There's a reason it's a novel. And the reason it's a novel is because it needs that pacing in order to have that intrigue, in order to have that interest, in order to have that pizzazz. If you try to shrink it into 3 pages, it's just going to be way too fast-paced, way too bluntly foreshadowed, and ultimately way too intense. It's not going to be as interesting because it's basically going to be the equivalent of like, and there was a scary vampire and he better to the end. That's not nearly as interesting. So if you want to retell a novel-based story, retell it as a novel. If you want to retell a short story as a short story, that's great too. And if you want to retell a short story as a novel, that's great. But you can't go novel to short story. You probably could, but let's put it this way. The amount of effort it would take to condense a novel into an adequately satisfactory short story is beyond immense. Not impossible, but beyond immense. It takes a lot of extra effort to be able to condense a novel into an adequate and beautiful short story that does justice to the original. So, in short, if you want to go from a novel to a short story, please don't do it. If you want to go from a short story to a novel, that's fine. Or if you want to turn a short story into another short story, or a novel into another novel, that's great. But don't try to condense a novel into a short story. Novels are long for a reason, and it's just super difficult to make a short story out of a novel. Not impossible, but I will say that if you get a lot of feedback on your short story saying it's super rushed, saying that the foreshadowing was too blunt, saying that you're struggling to develop the characters and that it feels like everything is just moving too fast, that's probably why if you're trying to condense a novel into a short story. All right. Last thing. Make sure to find the original story, whatever that is. For example, with Cinderella, don't go watch Disney and then try to retell the Disney version. That is not the original. And the reason that's not going to work is because even though it has all the same key elements, there's a lot of other elements that are introduced and played up as key elements, even though they are not key elements. They're Disney's original elements. Same thing with Beauty and the Beast. A lot of people assume that the furniture being alive was a crucial part of Beauty and the Beast. It was not. That is 100% made up by Disney. It was not in the original story at all. So if you do have living furniture in your Beauty and the Beast retelling, know that you are not retelling the original. You are retelling Disney's version. And watch out, because Disney's scary about their copyrights. So I would highly recommend, with stories that you are trying to retell, read the original first. Know back and forth and sideways and backways and up and down exactly what this story is like in the original context, especially if it's a grim fairy tale, because you need to know what you want to keep and what you want to cut out, because they were very dark. I would also say, if you are retelling a short story / fairy tale, make sure that the words / descriptors are your own. For example, if we have someone who is wearing a beautiful blue ball gown and her godmother saying bippity boppity boo, that is not your own original wording. That is Disney's wording. And again, Disney will crawl down your throat and eat you. Disney's scary about copyright. But even if you aren't copying Disney, even if you're copying someone else, make sure that your words are your own and the descriptors are your own. Make sure that someone's not reading it and going, I know what movie you watched or what story you read to get this from. If they're going, this feels familiar, that's not good. And part of the reason why that is because, again, it makes us feel like it's no longer original. Part of what keeps us gripped in your story is that this is a unique retelling of this. If you lose that uniqueness by using other people's descriptors and other people's words, then you lose what makes your story uniquely yours and beautifully yours. It's important that your story is yours and yours alone. Not just because of copyright reasons, but because your telling of the story is beautiful all by itself. You don't have to copy J.K. Rowling. You don't have to copy Jane Austen. You don't have to copy Jennifer A. Nielsen in order to be a good writer. Find your own unique writing style and use it to the best of your ability. All right. Do we have any questions about fairy tales / story retellings? Not really? Okay. Then I suppose I will just end the video early. Remember, if you want to do the first chapter contest, the prompt is simply write a first chapter. It can be any genre that you want, as long as it is a first chapter. It can't be chapter 1 and chapter 2, that will get you disqualified. It can't be chapter 3, it will get you disqualified. It has to be chapter 1. And it has to feel like a first chapter. It can't just be like, I took the first chapter from part 1 in the middle of my book. No. Make sure that it's the first chapter of your novel. Next thing is the Christmas contest. It's a cozy mystery contest. So I will say that we will primarily be looking for good writing and high quality writing. But secondarily, we do have a category that judges based on whether or not you follow the prompt. And the prompt does say cozy. Now, what does cozy mean? That means you emphasize more of the solving of the mystery than you do the gory dead body bits. If you're describing how the murder happened, that's no longer cozy. However, if they're in another room and they've closed and locked the door and they're all trying to solve the mystery around the nice cozy fire, that's good. Or alternatively, if they're running through the snow and they're trying their best to figure out who the killer is, but they just can't seem to figure it out, and so they stop and they make camp and they all talk around the campfire, being like, well, you were gone for 20 minutes, what were you doing? That feels a lot more cozy because of the fact that you're focusing again on those cozy mystery solving elements and you're putting them in a cozy, comfortable setting, even if the mystery is suspenseful and intense. This one simply requires that it takes place during Christmas. I don't care anything else. You can have it be a mystery of who stole Santa's cookies, or you can have it be a murder mystery. I don't care. As long as it is a cozy mystery and it takes place during Christmas, those are my only requirements for that particular grading category. And again, that's not the end-all be-all. That is just worth 5 points at maximum. So if you want to just completely forgo that and have it be a 1, know that that might not be your best move, but at the same time, if you write super high quality and you get a 1 in that category but a 5 in all the other categories, you'll probably still win. However, if I will say you do have to have at least elements of Christmas in it. I am going to be more favoring those that take place during Christmas time and are a cozy mystery because they follow the prompt. So if you do get a 1 in that category, just know that I may only give you an honorable mention because of the fact that technically you didn't follow the prompt, even if your story was amazing. So, that being said, I'm going to turn off the video now, and if you guys have any questions, again, feel free to comment or email me.